Okay, I'm going to take you through some common issues that you'll have on this type of machine. This is a 4300. These machines, honestly, don't have any major issues. I'll start with that. So when I say issues, these are real common, I would say, issues that you would expect to have on any machine, and or are okay to have on these machines, because these are great machines. That's not the purpose of this video, but the purpose of this is to give you a heads up that you could experience some things on these, and this is kind of what you would expect. The major issues that I would say on these are plastics, right? The hood, the side panels, the grill, and the cowls, which go around the steering area and the platform area. Those are all plastic. Those all get brittle because they're always in the sun, and most machines spend a lot of time outside. So all the plastic on the machine is going to get brittle. It's going to break over time. So expect to replace some panels in a hood and or a grill or whatever's plastic on this machine. The other thing on these is seats, right? Seats always go on tractors, but again, because they're outside. Anything that's rubber, anything that's plastic, anything that's out in the sun that's rubber or plastic is gonna get destroyed. And it's no different with a tractor. So that's why they'll put these coverings on the hoses that you see. That protects it from the sun, all that stuff, right? It also protects it from getting cut from a branch, but really it's the sun that you got to worry about. Tires on these things, they're no different than any other tractor. They last just fine, but if you're going to keep it outside, you're going to have cracked tires, right? You're going to see the dry rot, the dry and the cracking around the edges and the sidewalls. This one here, this machine here is really clean. It has new front tires on it, and it has a newer set of rear tires, so there's no issues with that. But expect to have problems if the machine has been out in the sun and it's been exposed to the sun for a long period of time. So what's real specific about these? Again, the hood, the plastic areas. Another thing that's real common on these is either the fuel gauge or the temperature gauge will have issues with the internal windings of the gauge, if you will, that are actually part of the dash assembly. So unfortunately, there's nobody who's made an aftermarket replacement gauge for the dash assembly for either the fuel or the temperature. You have to replace the entire gauge, the entire dash assembly, which is not optimal, because when you do that, the aftermarket one is really not that nice. It's a made in China dash, unless you get the John Deere one. So the John Deere one is about $600 or $700. The aftermarket one's about $200 or $300. And again, the aftermarket dash, you do not really want that because it's not as nice. And the other issue is that the glass doesn't fit. The factory glass won't fit properly. So long story short is that there is definitely issues with the fuel gauge and or the temperature gauge on these. So that's another thing to watch out for. The hazard switch and the relay assembly is in, I believe it's in this turn switch, right? So there is a major issue with that. It usually goes on every single 4300 or 4000 series machine that I work on. The turn signal box is bad. That's this guy over here. Not a big deal, obviously, because it's just the turn signals, but also for the hazards, it runs through that same switch. So when that goes, you don't have the hazards anymore. You don't have your turn signals, and you kind of want to replace it, because the hazards are something you're going to use on the road a lot if you travel down the road with this, if you're going from a field or whatever you might be doing. Another common issue on these, I would say is the relays. The relays on these, they tend to get corroded, and eventually they work, they don't work, they work, they don't work, and you're gonna have to change them. So those are the relays right there. And the way these are set up is that some of these relays are power relays, meaning that they're controlling the voltage, the power in on the circuit, and some are ground relays where they're controlling the ground out to the ground on the machine circuits, right? So definitely real common. Get yourself, buy yourself some relays. You can buy them by the box. I buy them by the box of 12, and I get the aftermarket ones, and they're fairly cheap. So that's what I do. So relays are real common. The other real common thing on the 4000 series is the fuel shutoff solenoid. That is notorious for acting up, and if it does, it's usually either a bad relay on these guys, or on the case of some of the 4010 series machines, it could be there's a relay for the pull-in relay has a timer relay, and so that is something that could be an issue. But long story short on that is that the fuel shutoff solenoid is definitely something that's pretty common on these that goes. So expect to replace that eventually. And I think outside of that, the knuckles, I think all tractors, the knuckles tend to leak after a while. So the steering knuckles in the front, they're not overly sensitive to being used, but it's pretty normal. And on the 4000 series, usually one of the two knuckles will leak. Perhaps, this one doesn't because it has low hours, but expect that to be something normal. And then sometimes you'll see the wheel bearing seals on the front and or the back, they can develop a leak as well, especially if the machine was used for mowing and it constantly went in a circle over and over again, put pressure on that wheel. And I think that would probably do it on the list of things. Some of the the 4300s with the 48 backhoes, they can develop cracking on the rear housing where the bolts are tapped into the rear housing. There's a bracket that goes on the machine first, and then the backhoe mounts to that bracket. I've seen it once or twice, and I've done a ton of these machines, and usually it happens because the bolts, they came loose just a little bit and allowed that bracket to slip. And as that slips more and more, the bolts loosen up more and more, and then eventually it cracks the housing. It doesn't crack it to the point where there's a case issue or an oil issue, and you need to change the rear housing. It just cracks it enough around the threads where you want to tighten it back up again, of course, and you want to keep that plate from moving around on the frame. So that's really the issue with the plates. Keep the nuts tight, right, and the bolts tight on there. There's no nuts, there's just bolts, but keep the bolts tight on the back plates, and that won't happen. So that's my list. I say there's not a lot of issues on these. Most of the stuff is relatively minor, and you'd expect to see that kind of thing. And yeah, these are great machines. If you have any more questions, you're thinking about buying one, and you're seeing some issues on it, feel free to reach out on my channel. So I wanted to add one more thing, and this is across all the 4000 series machines. The brakes that tend to stick, right? So internally, there's a lever that goes through the rear axle, and it operates the brake, right? And whether it's the parking brake or the foot brake, right? It all goes to the same area on the machine, and either the left or the right will stick. And once it starts to stick, there's really not a lot you can do besides take the wheel off that side, and then you got to operate the brake until it's not sticking anymore, meaning take a wrench, try to manually operate the brake mechanism from the axle area, not using the pedal, of course. On the machine at that point, you're using a tool just to manually move the brake back and forth. You can move it back like about 30 times, 40 times, and then you're gonna put WD-40 in there, and you can get that to operate normally again. Unfortunately, once that starts to stick, like I said, on you, you have to do something about it, because it won't unstick itself naturally from just the using of the brakes, right, with your feet. You have to get in there with a tool, operate the brake lever, control lever a few dozen times, maybe 100 times, right, and then put some WD-40 in there, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and eventually it'll free up just like new and return to normal. That is real common, and when I get a machine like this, it's real common for one of the sides to stick, and that'll drag the machine. It's really not good to operate the machine like that, because it'll wear down that one side, the brake assembly, which is bad, obviously, and it puts drag on the drivetrain, and the machine will tend to kind of want to drive a little twisted when you try to take off, or when you come to a rolling stop. It doesn't roll, it kind of twists to a stop. You can tell one side is definitely stuck. So that is very common, and I have a video on my channel how to unseize that brake, and that process I explained is on my video. But that is the other thing I wanted to mention, which is a common issue on all the 4000 series machines.